Mr. President, inflation numbers came out this morning, and once again, they were not good. Inflation in June was 9.1%. 9.1%, the highest level since November of 1981. Groceries are up 12% on average. Baby food is up 14%. Milk, up 16%. Chicken is up 18%. And the list goes on. Household cleaning products are up 11%. Gas prices are up nearly 60%. Furniture and bedding are up 13%. Utility gas service is up 38%. Health insurance is up 17%. And on and on and on. Mr. President, everywhere Americans look, they're facing price increases. Price increases on the most essential items: groceries, gas, their utility bills. And on top of all this, real average hourly earnings are currently declining at the fastest pace in 40 years. 58% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. Price increases on the most essential items: groceries, gas, their utility bills. All these things, Mr. President, are forcing Americans to dig into their savings when they have them to try and make ends meet. Others relying on things like credit cards or visits to food banks. Demand for food assistance has soared in recent months. One organization in my hometown in South Dakota received 600 more calls for food assistance in May of this year than it had received in the same month a year ago. And food banks often have fewer resources to meet the need, thanks to declines in donations and the high price of groceries. And, Mr. President, there is no end to this pain in sight. A recent Joint Economic Committee analysis found that inflation will cost the average household $7,620 over the next year, or $635 per month. $635 per month. That's an unsustainable burden for working families. Mr. President, by now most Americans are familiar with how we got here. When President Biden took office, inflation was at 1.4%, well within the Fed's target inflation rate of 2%. And it might have stayed there had Democrats not decided to pass a massive and partisan $1.9 trillion spending spree under the guise of COVID relief. Mere weeks after Congress had passed a fifth bipartisan COVID bill that met essentially all current pressing COVID needs. The Democrats' so-called American Rescue Plan sent a lot of unnecessary government money into the economy. And the economy overheated as a result. And you don't have to take my word for that. The damaging effects of this legislation. Here's what one Democrat economist who worked in the Obama administration had to say on the subject, and I quote, "The $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan passed in the early days of the Biden administration will go down in history as an extraordinary policy mistake," end quote. Or as another former Obama advisor noted, and I quote again, "The original sin was an oversized American Rescue Plan. It contributed, I should say, to both higher output, but also higher prices," end quote. So, Mr. President, those are warnings that came from Democrats that their so-called American Rescue Plan ran the risk of overheating the economy. But Democrats here in Congress passed it anyway. The President signed it. And what's almost worse is that even after they saw the inflation that resulted from their $1.9 trillion boondoggle, they spent months last year trying to double down on the reckless spending that helped cause so much inflation in the first place. Even as inflation was steadily increasing, Democrats spent months working to pass their so-called Build Back Better bill, a multi-trillion dollar reckless tax and spending spree that would have dumped more unnecessary government money into an already overheated economy. Well, fortunately, their efforts ultimately failed last December. But like a zombie, Democrats' Build Back Better tax and spending spree just keeps coming back from the dead. That's right. Despite the fact that our inflation crisis is even worse now than it was last fall, Democrats are once again considering a version of their Build Back Better tax and spending spree. We don't know all the details yet, but what we do know is cause for alarm. Democrats are planning to raise taxes by $1 trillion. $1 trillion. And a substantial part of that tax increase would come in the form of new taxes on small businesses. That's right, on small, individually and family-owned businesses, or what are often called pass-through businesses. In other words, Mr. President, Main Street America, the businesses that create jobs. In South Dakota, pass-throughs such as sole proprietorships, S corporations, partnerships, employ an estimated 68% of the private sector and represent almost 100%, 99% or thereabouts of all the businesses in my home state of South Dakota. Nationwide, more than 90% of American businesses are pass-throughs. And these businesses employ tens of millions of Americans. Mr. President, small business owners' expectations for better business conditions recently hit an all-time low. Business owners are struggling with the high cost of everything from inputs to electricity as inflation continues to soar and global supply chains continue to be sluggish. I recently read a comment from one small business owner in South Dakota who noted, and I quote, "It's hard when you're working so hard, but you're not making money." We are right there right now, end quote. It's hard when you're working so hard, but you're not making money. Yes, it is, Mr. President. And if Democrats have their way, life for small business owners and their employees is going to get even harder. Because raising taxes on businesses will lead to a combination of lower wages for workers, lower returns for business owners, and higher prices for goods and services. It's just intuitive. Think about it. If you're a small business owner and everything that you're paying more for inputs and all the supplies that you need to run your business, and then the government says, oh, we're going to hand you a big fat tax increase on top of that, what happens? Well, you can take lower profits, and some of them certainly I'm sure will, but inevitably that gets passed on in the form of higher cost to consumers, to the people that they serve, their customers, or in the form of lower wages to their employees. That's what it's going to do, Mr. President. It will also make it more challenging for small business owners to reinvest in and grow their businesses. As I said, altogether, Democrats are contemplating raising taxes by $1 trillion in their new Build Back Better tax and spending spree. And those tax hikes and their economic impacts are not going to be limited to small businesses, nor are they going to be limited to families bringing home more than $400,000, despite the fact that the President has repeatedly pledged not to raise taxes on families making less than that. The nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation studied the tax and spend provisions that Democrats are discussing. And its analysis shows that lower and middle-income taxpayers will face significant hits from the proposed tax hikes. The Joint Committee on Taxation analysis, again, bipartisan, nonpartisan organization, studies the implications of taxing and spending provisions on our economy and on classes of different people in this country. That JCT analysis found that more than half of Americans earning between $100,000 and $200,000 would see a tax hike next year, as well as a quarter of Americans making between $75,000 and $100,000 a year. Raising taxes on small businesses, including pass-throughs in South Dakota and across this country, is a reckless approach to the economy. Mr. President, we have an economy that's wobbly. I just mentioned that the inflation numbers are historic. 9.9 or 9.1%. We haven't seen that kind of inflation since 1981, back when I was in college. We got an economy that some argue is already in a recession, depending on what ultimately the numbers are for the second quarter of this year, but some people, or economists, are expecting negative GDP growth for a second quarter, which by the clinical, technical definition would put the country already into a recession, but most economists and people who study this suggest that there's a likelihood, certainly a likelihood of a recession within the next year. And so we have the prospect of a recession. We're looking down at the possibility of record inflation coupled with a recession. And what do the Democrats want to do? Raise taxes. Raise taxes and grow government. Spend more. Flood the zone with more spending. Hit businesses with higher taxes, which will get passed on in the form of lower wages and higher prices. So, Democrats apparently are content with the idea of a recession. They almost want to seem to guarantee that we want to get there. And I am at a loss to understand any other reason why they would be contemplating increasing the tax burden on small businesses and middle-class Americans during an inflation crisis. Mr. President, Democrats tried their hardest last fall to double down on the spending strategy that helped plunge us into this inflation crisis in the first place. Mercifully, and I say mercifully, and I thank God for a couple of discerning Democrats who saw otherwise, mercifully they failed. Let's hope that common sense will once again prevail, and the Democrats' latest reckless tax and spending proposal will come to nothing. American families are already suffering. They should not have to deal with the economic consequences of yet another ill-advised piece of Democrat legislation. Mr. President, I yield the floor.